Hello and welcome to the Metropolitan State University podcast, brought to you by the Marketing and Communications Department. My name is Jake Nadeau, and I will be your host for this episode. Today, we will be talking to Layne about video game culture, the video game culture course, and the opportunities a video game minor has to offer. Thanks for listening. Hello, Alex. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. All right. So why don't you tell me a little about yourself and your role here at Metro State?
All right. So I am a newly associated professor in the Department of Technical Communication and Professional Writing, and I'm also in charge of the Video Game Studies minor. I graduated with my PhD from Purdue University in Rhetoric and Composition in 2014, came straight here to Metro, and have been working here ever since.
That's great. All right. And so today we are going to be talking about video game culture, which is the kind of this new phenomenon. And so I want you to give us a simple definition of what video game culture is, and then maybe a more complex version.
Okay, so video game culture is something that's very cyclical. So our culture every day, how we view gender, how we view race, how we interact with the world, all of those things are reflected in video games. So that's one aspect of what we study. So games are what I call a rhetorical cultural snapshot. They are a snapshot of how we view certain things today. For example, in early Lego games, women would stand sort of with their knee up like they were in a kissing position, and men would stand in a wide-legged stance, the male Legos, right? And that's like sort of a micro example of something that didn't need to be there for the game, didn't need to be there for any other reason, but are there because the people who program it view gender a certain way or view whatever a certain way. So that's an example of how video game culture works as a reflective tool. But then the other side, this isn't simple or a simple definition, so I'm sorry about that. So then the other side that we look at is how video games influence culture. So the video game revolution that started in the late 80s, early 90s, how that changed a generation of Americans. Today, let's say around 2007, you have the social gaming revolution where people started playing games like Farmville, and people started playing games on their phone in line for coffee. Completely changed the landscape of games, but also completely changed the landscape of our culture. So we also look at the roles that video games have in changing our own day-to-day culture.
Yeah, so I'm pretty familiar with video games, but the video game culture, it opens up a whole new viewing of the video games itself. One thing I've noticed when playing video games is that some are single player games, and you mentioned the multiplayer wave. Some people there's a discussion that is gaming an anti-social event or a social event, and I just wanted to get your opinion on what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and one that game scholars struggle with a lot. I would say that and violence are the two things that constantly get asked of us about video games. So are games social or not social? I would say they're exactly as social as the person playing them. So if, for example, my husband and I, we sit next to each other, we play different game consoles, even different TVs, even though we're playing the same game, and we'll talk and interact, and we'll, set up like, oh, I did this in so long, and you only did it in this so long. So we take a very not social game. It's not online. It's not two-player. You're playing against the computer, but we play it in a very social way. That's called couch co-op, when people play games together in the same room. And there is a huge contingent of people, especially since the demographic of who plays games is skewing older, and the genders are almost 50-50 for who plays games. Couch co-op gaming is becoming... It's interesting because more people want it, but fewer games are being made for it. More games are being made in the sort of Fortnite style, the online multiplayer style, where you're playing with 20 people. But you have a game like that, and I wouldn't say that's necessarily social at all. Just because you're playing against real people instead of the computer, you're not talking, you're not interacting. Most of the time, it's a one-off match that you could get paired with a totally different group the next time, and it doesn't really matter. Now, there's clans and things that you can make it social, but the most multiplayer game in the world you can play by yourself, and the most single player game in the world you can play with other people. So I think that question is it's reflective of what the person is looking for out of a game. And you have these tropes like, a basement dweller that sits down in his parents' basement, he's 30 and never contributes anything to society and never talks to anybody or interacts with people. And you're going to have that stereotype forever, just like, anybody who has anything to do with any media, whether it's, watches too much television or too many movies or too much music or whatever, you're always going to have some sort of, stereotype or archetype or something. But I think we're finding that stereotype is not the norm. It's often not true, but there are plenty of people who live in their parents' basement and do nothing, whether they play video games or not. So I think there's some, but that's not a major thing you see in games.
And so we've talked a bit about video game culture, and Metro State now teaches a course on video game culture. So what exactly does the course focus on?
So the course is Media Studies 3D1, Video Game Culture. And it changes each semester. Since I introduced it 2 years ago, I've tweaked it several times. This will be my 4th time teaching it, I think. There's one component that's pretty significantly about identity in video games. So we're talking race, gender, sexuality. Video games is notoriously and has earned its reputation for being really hostile, for being, I don't want to say not politically correct, because it's often a lot more sort of vitriolic and violent than that, but being very, very toxic. And it's earned that reputation. And so part of any education in games is going to be looking at how people use video games to explore their own identities and the issues that happen with, for example, when you represent a Native American character in games. In the 90s, you would put a feather in their hair and give them a name like Chief something or other, and that would be your Native American culture. So video games have evolved a lot since then. The community's evolved a lot since then. I'd like to hope that trend for the majority is true. And so you want to teach people about how to accurately, respectfully represent other people's cultures in games, and what that means. But also there's an aspect of, if you're an African-American player and you're playing in games and you have a name that sounds African-American, you're probably going to get more harassment than a player who has a name that can't be identified of race or gender. Mm-hmm. Same if you have a name that's female as your avatar or whatever. You're going to be getting a different kind of treatment from the game community. So we study that and what's going on with that. And students I found are extremely interested because that matches with their day-to-day experience in games. A lot of video game harassment and sexism, racist language, things like that. So we study that. That's a huge component of the class. The second is video games as rhetorical cultural artifacts. So we study a book that breaks down I think it's 16, my students would probably make fun of me for not knowing this off the top of my head, but the 16 ways that culture influences games and games influence culture. And it really breaks it down to a practical level that's easy for students to digest. And so you can see exactly how, for example, choosing a game platform has economic ramifications for players, whether you choose a 99-cent phone game or a $60 game that you need a console. That's going to change design decisions, but those decisions are really based in an economics of how you're going to be making money and who you think should afford your game and things like that. The third has changed every time I've taught the class. So originally it was historical, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, looking at how play has evolved throughout our culture, the concept of play. And then it changed to, the students hated it. So I totally nerded out, but they hated it. So then I changed it to the social game revolution. But that, again, was dated, a bit dated, and everybody hated it. So the last time I taught the class, we did how video games can change the world. And there's a scholar out of California, Jane McGonigal, who talks about using video games and leveraging the creative energy and engagement of games to solve the world's most urgent problems. And so we use that as sort of our third module, and that was really successful. So I think we'll be sticking with that. People really connected to that because one of the things about gamers is they always believe that they can solve the most urgent problem, right? Because they play games and they save worlds all the time and they go on epic missions and epic quests, right? And so you have this whole generation of people primed. If you could just find the right way to present the task, that are primed to take it on. And you don't want to be sitting around twiddling your thumbs, right? You want to be doing something meaningful. Human beings are constructed to do meaningful things. So we really look at that and how play can tap into that.
Wow, yeah. And so you mentioned that video games influence culture, and so culture influence is video games. And so if a student's not really into video games, why should they take video game culture then?
So there is an element of you kind of have to like games to get the most out of this class. And I will say that another way because I immediately disagree with myself. So you need to be open to games. You will likely, I have had students who take particularly a class, Media Studies 363, Children, Adolescents, and the Media, the Culture of Games. And that's looking at the impact of video games on children. And I have had students in there who were very skeptical of games, who weren't gamers at all, who thought they were a negative influence. If you have an open mind, they are not the classes to come tell you about why video games are evil. That's not what's happening in the classes, right? So, but people believe that, and they're worried about it. And they were worried about television in the 90s when I was in school, and they were worried about music, in the 60s and 70s before that. So I'm not surprised that video games are today's villain when it comes to popular media. But whether you like them or not, whether you think they're a positive or negative influence or not, they're the largest entertainment industry in the entire United States. They're bigger than Hollywood. They're bigger than the music industry combined. They make the most money of any other entertainment industry, and they're not going anywhere. They're growing and growing, and more people are spending more and more hours playing them. So you can ignore them, you can hate them, you can do whatever you want. But in the end, I think having an understanding about how they work and we certainly don't pull any punches. Like, we talk about the toxic culture in the gaming community. I mean, absolutely, it's a huge part of games and it's a huge problem. But that's why the education piece is so important, because the more people think about their behaviors and think about their actions and think about things in terms of what's happening at a culture at large, instead of just in the moment, I'm mad because that person just beat me in this game, the better the community is going to get as a whole. So I have a student right now in my video game writing class that doesn't play any games, but sees his nieces and nephews playing games and just kind of wanted to figure out what it's all about. And the game he's making in that class is like sort of basic game for kids about bullying. So even this person who is not a gamer, who hadn't played a game in many years, and I force you in that class, you do have to play a game. I would like to think he's getting a ton out of it by learning more about this thing that is happening all around us.
And this video game culture course is part of the video game minor. And so it's kind of a new minor here at Metro State. So what can this minor provide for students who are interested in video games?
So there is no game-related major anywhere in the state of Minnesota. The closest one is UW Stout, a game design and development major, and that is it's more arts-focused than anything. So if you love games and you live in the state of Minnesota, you don't really have anywhere to study them. So the minor gives you a chance to have a college-level education. The scholarship surrounding games has grown just enormous. So there's a ton of scholarly interest now, and that is not true it was less true when I started in this job, and it was not true at all when I started my PhD. There was zero scholarly interest in games. Now there's a huge contingent. So if you want to have a deeper understanding of games and their meaning and what makes a good game versus a bad game, all of those things, this minor gives you the chance to do that. It pairs very well with certain majors. For example, screenwriting. Video game writing is something that my students have been really successful at. You can take the major in conjunction with a screenwriting minor. Creative writing. You could do technical communication, professional writing. You could do computer science, any of programming specific. This is a great minor towards, because again, in the state of Minnesota, if you want to be a game designer or be a game developer, you don't have the option of getting a degree in that, but you can pair a minor with a major that would give you a better understanding of how games work, and that could help you in your future career.
Oh, that minor sounds like a great opportunity. And so, lastly, I want to ask you where, if students are interested in getting your information, where they can find that.
So you can go ahead and look up the things for the minor on the website. You should just be able to either Google game studies, Metro State, something like that. My email address is alex.layne@metrostate.edu. You could always email me. I am involved in a lot of different events that happen around campus. Usually, I'm never in one place, but I'm always out and about somewhere, and am very responsive to emails, getting people who want to get involved and things like that. So the best way to get in contact with me is to reach out to me through email. And if you want to find more information about the minor, just on the website.
Sounds good. Well, thanks again, Alex, for coming in and being a part of this episode.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to thank Alex Layne again for coming on this episode. If you have any more questions, head on over to metrostate.edu. Thanks again for listening.